Hello, friends of the Chamber Orchestra of the Springs. I'd really want to be with you there in person because I had such a wonderful time 12 years ago when you performed, when you got to hear our performance of Rebecca Clarke's Concerto for Viola. And that was a new orchestration of her viola sonata. So that was a wonderful event that I'll always remember. And I enjoyed being there so much for that. But pandemic and things like that, it's just not a great time to travel. So here I am via Zoom. And for no reason at all, I'm wearing my Amy Beach t-shirt, but that's just one of the things I've been doing for the last 12 years. Okay. Louise Farrenc is one of my favorite composers. I've been listening to her music and collecting CDs of her works for many years. So it's a great opportunity to have this chance to talk about her. So thank you so much. I'm sure you know that the New York Times had a wonderful recent essay about Farrenc, and her music, especially her orchestral music, is being discovered in North America. I mean, these rediscoveries of works by women, they often start with the chamber music because that is so much more accessible to perform. An orchestra is a big deal, many people, complicated. And so Louise Farrenc's symphonies, I think, have been overlooked, but are now really starting to pick up and gain some momentum. So that article in the New York Times does a great job at introducing her to us, her and her music, and really generating some excitement. I was also recently reading an article in the New York Review of Books, a review of a book titled Beethoven's Lives, the Biographical Tradition. So this is not a study of Beethoven or his music, but rather a study of the study. So I could not help but be struck by the contrast. Louise Farrenc and pretty much all women composers are still far from receiving such luxurious treatment to have studies of studies. So for Farrenc, we have no thorough or engaging or accessible biographical study, even no complete works list. There is an edition that calls itself a complete edition, and while it's very valuable and helpful, it is not complete, and it's often difficult to access as well. But also scholarly studies and editions need to be enhanced by storytelling. To quote again from the review of Beethoven's Lives, our understanding of the music has always been shaped by the stories we tell about the man. So for a composer named Louise, like Beethoven, also a brilliant pianist, also writing chamber music and piano music, as well as compelling and turbulent symphonies, we need to look at her life and find some stories and have these connected and enmeshed with our understanding of the music. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. And for many years, this engraving was the only image we had of Louise Farrenc. And so when I started collecting and listening to recordings of her music, this was, the way I would think of her. And it's still the image we see quite frequently. We saw it in the New York Times article. So this engraving shows an elegant woman, but she looks a bit stern and even peeved, as we really don't get much depth of character in this illustration. And this engraving is drawn from this drawing, and this has her, you see her signature here in the lower corner. But in 2004, when we were celebrating, or scholars, the people making the edition, were working on, celebrating her bicentennial of her birth, this painting was discovered an oil painting from 1835 by Luigi Rubio. And it was found in the hands of her family, her relatives. So it's like no one got around to asking about, say, is there a painting by her, of her? And so, you know, she was from a family of visual artists, sculptors, so it made sense for that there would be a portrait. She was with all these people in Paris. So here we see real depth of character, warm flesh tones, you know, blood in her cheeks, and you know, penetrating eyes, wise, patient warmth. This is someone we can really be fascinated with. An orchestra from France, from Paris, the Insula Orchestra, they did a little animation of it, and you know, so which really has kind of literally made it come alive. So she's born into this artistic family, the Dumont family, in Paris, and her musical talent is recognized at an early age. She begins piano study at age 6, and begins the study of composition with Anton Reicha. He was had known Beethoven. He was a German, and so she has, but she's not allowed to study at the conservatory because they don't accept women students to study composition, but she studies with him privately and has her piano studies with some illustrious figures as well, Ignaz Moscheles and even Hummel. And she marries, takes time out from her studies to marry Aristide Farrenc, and this was a very wonderful marriage. That he was a flute player. He had left his was originally from Marseille and wanted to live in Paris with the artistic life there, and they performed together. He was very encouraging of her, and he had worked as a performer in the Paris Opera, but he eventually gives that up and starts a publishing business. And of course, that's a very helpful thing for her as well. And he's very proud of her and seems to be very encouraging all the time. So they're, and then she goes back and studies further with Reicha composition. So their daughter is born in 1826, and Victorine, and she will eventually become a very skilled pianist as well. The portrait is painted in 1835. Perhaps, I can imagine, maybe to celebrate the success of her first orchestral work, the Overture No. 1. And but piano publications start in the 20s, and she has more works for piano than anything else, but also quite a few chamber works praised by Robert Schumann, a lot of positive criticisms. The set of piano etudes becomes adopted by the conservatory as required study. So that's something very significant. And that's after she's appointed as professor there in 1842. Her first symphony was premiered in Brussels, and then Victorine, by this point, is performing. She performs Beethoven's Emperor Concerto on that same concert. And the conductor was Fétis, who I know more as a historian, but also a critic and conductor, and leading and championing a lot of these composers who were not doing what was so important for musical life in Paris, when the dominating thing of musical life in Paris was opera. And so doing symphonic music was seen as something serious and really not quite fashionable in Paris. So, and her third symphony was premiered in 1849. And this Société du Concert of the conservatory, they always had works by Beethoven on them. So they were always being compared and paired with music by Beethoven. So that somehow was not always an optimal kind of presentation for a new work to always be compared in the spotlight with Beethoven. In 1850, her Nonette is premiered, and it's quite a sensation. And she wrote it with Joseph Joachim, the young violin virtuoso. He was 19 years old at the time of the premiere of the Nonette, and she wrote it with him in mind. And I think also in the case of these, going back to these piano quintets that she wrote in 1839 and 1840, the piano quintets that include a string bass, so violin, viola, cello, and bass, because there was a famous string bass player in the opera who would perform in them. So she didn't have the more usual instrumentation of, like a string quartet with the two violins. She had a string bass instead. So she knew a lot of these musicians who were working in Paris and had a sensitivity to their playing and understood the instruments, and really had a very good sense of writing for these different ensembles. And there is some irony that this Nonette was such a success and became a very famous work, and that it didn't include her instrument piano. So, and after that, she had figured out that she wasn't getting paid at the same rate as her male colleagues at the conservatory. So that's when she went to demand that she be paid the same as they were. She demanded equal pay. And there's a wonderful little video made by the 92nd Street Y, so we can take a look at that.
Today we're going to talk about how Louise Farrenc, a 19th century composer, fought for equal pay. In a time when Beethoven, Berlioz, Chopin, and Mendelssohn are the biggest names in music, Louise Farrenc is also being celebrated as a brilliant composer of chamber music. In 1842, she becomes professor of piano at the Paris Conservatoire, making her the only woman in the entire 19th century to receive tenure there. But, surprise, surprise, Farrenc quickly finds out that her salary pales in comparison to what her male colleagues are making, even the more junior ones. So when Farrenc premieres her Nonette in 1850, featuring the famous violinist Joseph Joachim, she decides to stand up for herself. She writes to the director of the Paris Conservatoire and in a polite and eloquent way tells him to pay her what she's worth. And it worked! Farrenc was granted a raise that matched her male colleagues and remained at the Conservatoire for another 20 years. And that's how Louise Farrenc won equal pay in the 1800s.
And here's just a little quote from the letter that she wrote to Aubert, asking him to, pay her fairly. I dare hope, Monsieur Directeur, that you will agree to fix my fees at the same level as these gentlemen, because setting aside questions of self-interest, if I don't receive the same incentive they do, one might think I have not invested all the zeal and diligence necessary to fulfill the task which has been entrusted to me. Chamber music, really a lot of very, very fine and interesting chamber music, including these trios with one including clarinet and piano and cello, and one including flute and cello and piano, and of course flute, an instrument she knew so well from being married to a flautist. Her daughter dies, and that was a big tragedy. Her daughter was a very successful pianist, but she dies at the age of 32. And that was just devastating for the Farrencs. And from this point on, she really turns away from composing. And Aristide starts this new project of gathering historical keyboard music, and they begin publishing and editing that. By the time he dies, which I think is 1865, they've published 8 volumes, but then she goes on to publish the rest on her own and works on that very diligently, as well as her teaching. She was quite an acclaimed and successful teacher. Her students were always winning prizes and awards. And she gets this recognition, and her music is reprinted and kept in print for some decades after her death, in fact, but then eventually she does fade from music history. So She's a very remarkable composer, and certainly not the only woman composer of France. There is a book about in French about the French women composers of the 19th century. In February of 2020, the Philadelphia Orchestra prepared to perform Louise Farrenc's Second Symphony, and Yannick Nézet-Séguin was asked to say a few words about that. So he's asked, why is Louise Farrenc's music so rarely heard? But I think really his answer is astounding. And so he says, sadly, we don't historically have a lot of surviving works for orchestra by fantastic women composers. The reason is simple. Very often at that time, wonderfully talented women were asked to abandon their careers to support their husbands. This, of course, is a sad fact of history. I think what he's really saying is, I don't know, so I'm going to make things up and make some statements based on familiar stereotypes and assumptions. And so this is really the problem, that, why we've heard so little of Louise Farrenc is that we've based her music, our understanding of her music and her life, on assumptions, and just assumed that music history as it's been received has been based on a meritocracy. A fair process, but it hasn't. History has been influenced by sexism and also racism and a lot of other factors, but it's time to really evaluate music history and have a more objective look, a fresh look at what gets to be heard. And that takes some digging and going through historical sources, going through dissertations and scholarly articles, and editions of little-known music. And just let me insert here a little rant about some of the wonderful 19th century women composers who did not have husbands and had very prolific lives. And I think we haven't heard them because they're not attached to more familiar names. So say Emily Mayer was mentioned in the New York Times article. She composed 5 symphonies, no husband. Louisa Adolpha Lebeau composed piano concertos, tone poems, no husband. And Auguste Olmez was a very prolific composer in the late 19th century. No husband, had a lover and many children, but no husband. And, these women were doing just fine. But I think, this notion that there really a lot of times is a notion that, if the music was good, we would have heard of it. But I think the assumption that women were not composing has really been part of the problem all along, that women can't do this, that women are inferior. And if they're doing it, it's not any good. I mean, this is the whole thing about, women not having legal rights, not voting. They were seen as inferior, and that really affected the perception of their creative work. Because it's really time to listen to a lot of composers who have been neglected and let their music speak to us, because we are finally ready to listen. The recovery of music composed by remarkable composers like Louise Farrenc has been going on now for some decades. So let's learn and celebrate their stories. And today we get to be part of bringing this music to life. Thank you very much.